Welcome to First in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write great fiction. I'm Steve McLean, an aspiring writer.
I'm Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain and the Hand of Adonai series.
And I'm Heather Luby, the managing editor of the Citron Review.
All right. We have Heather back on the show, and this is her first time
Yay!
in Google Hangouts. So you guys will actually be able to see her on YouTube. This is going to go up to YouTube. For those of you listening on iTunes, we are now on YouTube. Did I mention we're on YouTube? I don't know if I mentioned that.
Can you say it one more time, Steve?
We're on YouTube.
Okay.
Okay.
I was wondering.
All right. So this week we are going to be talking about reading like a writer. Heather, do you want to describe what that means?
Sure. But I actually think before we talk about reading like a writer, we should talk about the importance of reading if you are a writer.
Oh, okay. Very cool.
Aaron, do you ever run into students or any of the classes that you teach? Do you run into writers who publicly admit that they aren't avid readers?
All the time. And I think actually when I started writing, that was a thing. I thought I was going to be the first writer that could write without reading. I think every writer feels that at some point, at least when they're teenagers, maybe. But that didn't work. And I did read though, for a while. But yeah, you have to read as a writer, and it becomes increasingly difficult because you have less time. The more time you're investing in writing, it seems like you have less time to read, but it doesn't negate the fact that it's still it's a fundamental skill, and it's something that still needs to be developed and honed and practiced.
What are some of your strategies in order to get reading done? Because I know you're a busy man.
I'm a fan of Audible. I like listening to my books. That's how I get most of my reading done, because the times that I actually have to sit down with book in hand are increasingly slim, and I don't anticipate them getting any more ample. And I
Yeah.
feel like every time I'm weird. Every time I sit down to read, I feel like, man, I could be writing right now. So I end up doing that, and I got a very long commute, so I do a lot of reading through my ears, actually.
Right. How about you, Heather?
I try my very best to do some reading every day, and it sort of varies. It might be that I'm reading an essay that somebody shared on Facebook. It might be that I'm
Hmm.
reading before bed, which is probably the time that I do most of my reading, is that I try to read for about a half an hour to 45 minutes before I go to sleep at night.
When you're nice and sharp-witted, like when we record these
Exactly.
podcasts, right?
This is my peak time apparently, right? It's only 10:30 here. And I make a habit of always carrying a book in my purse because there are always times, whether you are at a doctor's office or stuck in traffic, or in my case, in carpool line, or any number of places. Tonight I was at softball practice, and every time that my daughter was not up to bat or out on a base, I was reading my book.
Yeah. Yeah. I got to say, Kindle is also pretty awesome. Although my wife stole mine, but
Yeah.
I gave it to her to be nice. Although now it's breaking, so we're gonna have to get her a new one for Mother's Day.
There you go.
Um, yeah, she was afraid
But
she
I
wasn't
think
gonna
it's a
be able to read
common
tonight,
thing.
but it started randomly working again. But yeah, Kindles are awesome just because their portability, and you're able to read any kind of book, any length of book, anywhere, anytime, and even like PDFs and stuff. I love the Kindle or the Nook, I guess. I mean, whatever you use,
I
it's
read a
pretty
lot of
awesome.
PDFs on my Kindle when I have students who send me longer pieces, for
Yeah,
instance. I'll just upload it to
Yeah.
my Kindle and again take them with me. But it's a common thing that I hear an awful lot in classes that people say they're too busy to have time to read. And
Right.
like Aaron said, they want time to write, and so if they only have X amount of minutes in a day free, they want to be writing and not reading. So when
well,
I tell them that they need to be reading, I think it seems to them like an easy thing to ignore or to not really see the value or the importance of it, which is sort of why I thought that this podcast would be really helpful because I thought it could cover both things, like why you need to be reading, what is the importance of it, what purpose is it going to serve you as a writer, and then once you've accepted that you're not going to get out of it and you
Yeah.
realize its importance, then how exactly do you do that to make the most of it in terms of influencing your writing?
Yeah, and I have to say, like, most writers, the good writers that I ever read or listen to, they talk about all the time how the only way that you're going to be a very good writer is if you read a lot. And a lot of people that are very good writers read voraciously, a lot, a lot. And I gotta say, I tried writing on my drive to work, but it's just, it doesn't work very well.
It's a little hard to do.
So
That's
I
some
thought,
Keep your eyes on the road.
you
yeah,
definitely need to
underline.
practice that more.
Yeah,
It's
I think you're right.
it's a skill that comes with practice.
You know, it's funny. A few years ago, I was driving to work, and there's this little car that was driving about 45 miles an hour down the freeway, and I'm like, man, what is going on here? And so I got up next to the car and I kind of let off the gas to see what was going on, and I look over, and it's a teenage girl, and she's reading what I think was one of the Twilight books, just based on the size and shape and general time frame. On her steering wheel, she had it sitting on the steering wheel, and was reading it, driving 45 miles an hour down the freeway in the middle lane.
Well,
Feels
I
like
guess she wasn't texting.
Yeah, well, I guess. I've seen guys reading the paper too, so I mean, it's not just teenage girls, but yeah, the guys
that's
reading the paper actually, I've seen like two or three of those guys, and they drive way faster than 45, so apparently they've got a better handle on it or something. I don't know. That or
or
the news
or they
headlines are
don't.
stressing them out, and they're trying to get to work faster. I don't know.
Yeah.
So, Aaron, why do
Yeah.
I mean, I have my own reasons for why I think that it is important that you be a reader if you're going to be a writer. But why don't I'm going to ask you, I'm going to kick the ball to you first. Why do you think that it's essential that if you actually want to be a writer, that you need to be reading as well?
It's how you improve. It's a writer that doesn't read is like a baseball player that doesn't watch baseball, or a football player that doesn't watch football. It's an artist who doesn't look at art. It's a sculptor who doesn't look at sculptures. I mean, when that is your artistic medium, you need
It's
to
it's
make
like a
sure that.
it's like a surgeon who doesn't watch Grey's Anatomy.
Uh, I
Wah,
think that
wah,
might be
wah.
where it breaks down a little bit,
I'm
but
trying. I'm trying to help,
I
but
had
I
they're
love
not
that
helping.
analogy, by the way, Aaron. I
yeah,
was thinking about the sports analogy in terms of watching tape, especially
right,
like football, right? I mean, football players, they're always watching tape,
yeah,
and I never thought of that before, and I'm now going to use it.
I know,
yeah.
like boxers do that. They study their opponent's moves and how they fight, so that way when they get in the ring with them, they know what they're doing.
Right.
And if you want to continue that metaphor, that sports metaphor of knowing your competition, you can look at it in that way, where you want to know what other writers are doing. You want to know what the market is what's selling in the market. You want to know what people are buying. You want to know how you can, the level of competition that you're facing. But if you want to look at it less, I don't. I tend not to look at writing as a competition. I tend to think of it more as for me, it's a very personal thing in the aspect that I am my competition. I'm not competing against other writers. I'm competing against myself. I want to be the best that I can be. And so if you think of the football player who's watching tape, not of their opponents, but of themselves, right? They're going to watch, the wide receiver is going to watch themselves as they try and release from the press coverage. The quarterback's going to watch himself as he moves up in the pocket. These types of things, to find out where their skills are lacking, where they're struggling, where they're excelling, and ways to improve on their craft. And it's the same for writers.
So, what
Absolutely.
specifically are, like, Heather? What are you looking for when you read? I mean, what are the things that you're looking for that you're going to maybe incorporate into your own writing?
Well, I think that I don't so much go to look for things specifically that I think I'm going to incorporate. I kind of have a rule of thumb, which is if I am working on a piece, a novel or a short story, that whatever I'm reading at that time should inform my writing. in some way. So I could be reading all the time any number of things, but once I really dig into a project, especially something that is novel length, then and this is just me personally, but I limit myself to only those things that I think will inform my writing. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm just, let's say if I were writing a thriller, it doesn't mean that I'm just out there reading thrillers. A good example might be that when I was writing Laws of Motion, I knew that I was wanting to capture grief. So I went out and I read The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. And I read Joyce Carol Oates' memoir about her husband's death. I read essays from parents who had lost children, even though mine was about losing a spouse. I read C.S. Lewis. Is it On Grief? I forget the exact title. So I read a lot of books in that way. But then I also was writing from a first-person male point of view. So I went out and I got novels that I knew were written in a first-person male point of view. And I studied them as well. And because I had a mystery component, then I went and I found a few mysteries that were of a more literary bent as well. So that's what I mean by reading to inform my fiction while I'm writing, is that it didn't mean that I was looking for something that was identical to something that I was writing already, but it was surrounding myself with books and with knowledge that I could sort of absorb while I was writing that would put me in the right headspace or teach me something that could be directly applied to what I was writing at the time.
Well, that sounded kind of depressing. Was it a good book?
Well, let me tell you that when I finished writing, I really felt like I owed myself a trip to Disneyland.
Yeah, there you go.
Right.
When you just sort of immerse yourself for over a year in reading nothing, but because there was also a violent component of my book, there was a murder that took place. So I read a lot of autopsy reports to make sure that I got that correct. I read about how police handle violent crime and what services are families referred to. And even though a lot of this stuff didn't make it into my book, I felt like I needed to know it anyway. So yeah, I spent a year reading nothing but horribly dark, depressing material. Needless to say, what I'm working on now is not that dark.
I want to throw in here that I think if we want to bullet point this, that what we can say is research is reading, or reading as research is an important component to reading as a writer. And that I like what you say, that you're writing fiction, but you're reading a ton of nonfiction in order to prepare yourself to better understand your character, to flesh them out in such a way that's believable. And I don't think that fiction writers do that a lot. I think a lot of times they just invest their time only in fiction. If they're writing fantasy, they only read fantasy. And I like that you bring up the point of kind of broadening your horizons. And even though we may be writing a fantasy novel, there's going to be perhaps some element of grief. And so picking up something like The Year of Magical Thinking makes perfect sense. I kind of wish I had thought of it before. That's a perfect a book to read about when you're writing on Laws of Motion. So yeah, absolutely. Good points.
And to not be afraid to branch out into, like you said, not just nonfiction, but poetry. If you felt like your piece needs a little bit more of lyric language, or you're trying to really nail imagery better, go out and read poetry. If you really think that you need to work on dialogue, then make sure that you're out there reading plays.
Yeah, good advice. Something else I'll throw out there is something I like to do when I'm reading a book that's particularly inspiring and informing what I'm writing. I also like to stop by the author's blog and read some of the insights about how he or she had developed a story thread, or what they put into their characters, what kind of research they did, and how they got into the mindset, which is really useful. And not every author does that, but a lot of people will kind of narrate the process of how they arrived at what they arrived at for you on their blog, and that's a really good resource too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. I haven't done that much, but that's a good point.
Yeah. So what are let's see, what are some of the best things that you can think of that you've gotten out of reading other people's books? Aaron? I mean, what are some of the things that have just like turned on a light bulb for you and given you the inspiration to go and write something?
You know, it would be hard to pinpoint one thing, but I think if I were gonna mention one thing, it would be the precision of language and the subtlety of language, the lack of melodrama and purple prose, as we call it. I'm thinking specifically of guys like Cormac McCarthy, who is just an incredibly gifted writer, one of the, I think, American greats, still contemporary writer. Raymond Carver, guys like that could really tell a story in few words, but just have a complete control over the language to the point where just at every other page you're thinking, man, that's so brilliant, I wish I had done that. And you, even though you want to read it like a writer, the first instinct is just to enjoy, just to appreciate. It's the apprentice watching the masters. So specifically, who's coming to mind right now is Cormac McCarthy. I think that was the last experience that I had reading one of his works where I was just kind of left my jaw open a little bit.
Do you ever read something in the particular genre that you're writing, in the particular field or area that you're going for, and you think, man, this guy or girl has done exactly what I wanted to do, to the point where I kind of feel like I don't know if I can do any better. I don't know if I can improve on this or really bring my own unique perspective to it in a fulfilling way. Do you ever get discouraged when you're reading other people's writing?
I think that's how I feel every time I read something by Daniel Woodrell.
Hmm.
He's probably, I mean, I have a really hard time naming sort of a favorite writer since I almost feel like sometimes there's our favorite writers for different seasons, right, of life
Hmm.
and
Right.
of the time.
I haven't heard of David Woodrell, so enlighten me.
Daniel.
Who's that? Oh, Daniel. Daniel
Yeah,
Woodrell.
yeah. He wrote, probably he's most well known for writing Winter's Bone, which
Okay.
was made into a film with Jennifer Lawrence a few years ago, did well at Sundance. He writes a lot of what they refer to as sort of rural noir or grit lit. It's
Okay.
essentially what I want to write and what I've always wanted to write.
Okay, so that didn't bring any clarity. What is that exactly?
Um, well, you try to think about, I mean, it's a lot of times violent or the dark, gritty crime side of what can go on in sort of urban areas and rural areas.
Oh wow.
So Daniel Woodrell, or Woodrell, however we say his last name precisely, but he writes almost exclusively about the Ozarks because that is where he lives, and
Oh
that's
okay.
where I grew up. And so yeah, every time I read him, he has this fantastic way of melding together just really vivid imagery and beautiful language with stark, almost shocking language and violent images as well. And the way that the two things are weaved together, it's done in a way that I've not seen anyone else do.
I'm learning so much about you at this moment.
I that kind of makes me think of Charles Baxter's essay on stillness and the idea of the stark contrast between beauty and violence, and it's something that I think is clearly demonstrated in Flannery O'Connor's writing. She did kind of the same thing, I think, with the more rural kind of fiction, more often than not, and then there are often these acts of violence, but kind of sandwiched with a lot of beautiful language and prose. So yeah, those are I guess something else that I like to read.
Yeah, see, I like to read like Michael J. Sullivan, and who wrote the Rairia Revelations series. I like to read Brandon Sanderson, who wrote Mistborn and Stormlight and Warbreaker and Steelheart and Alcatraz versus the Evil Librarians and so many things I can't even count. Great books,
Right.
Elantris. And then I like to read, um, J.K. Rowling and obviously Stephanie Meyer. I like uh, I like the Twilight books. I do, and The Host was amazing. Those are all
Not the
things.
movie. Not I haven't read a book, but the movie, Steve, was not good.
I watched the movie, and I thought the
No,
movie was pretty good.
no, I think no.
I might be
We're gonna
blinded by my fandom. I
We're
don't
gonna
know.
have to table this for a later discussion
yeah, right,
and get
right,
back on
exactly.
track.
Yeah.
Well, luckily I'm not making movies. But that actually brings up an interesting point. I'll actually get a lot of inspiration from movies. Um,
Absolutely.
Actually, I watched the Pirates of the Caribbean or the Caribbean, whatever floats your boat or your pirate ship.
Hey,
I just want to be
well
fair.
played.
Uh, I watched those movies, and those movies are so inspiring. First of all, just the soundtrack alone is awesome, and I play the soundtrack or the Transformers soundtrack. That is an awesome soundtrack also. Or Batman. Batman is also good. Anyway, while I'm writing, because those are really great soundtracks and they're pretty inspiring. But yeah, do you guys watch movies that you find particularly inspiring that really inform the writing that help you out with just driving you and giving you that needed inspiration? I know every time I walk out of a good movie, I think I need to write. Give me a computer.
Well, movies were absolutely my very first love. I was a
Yeah.
slow reader. I didn't come into reading until I was really a teenager,
Hmm.
and it didn't really come easy to me, and I didn't really love it. But I
Wow.
grew up loving movies. My dad used to work at a video store, and I would go to work with him in the evenings. And if I helped out and I was really good, one of my treats was that I got to pick out movies. But I loved to watch movies with my dad. And so it didn't matter if it was westerns, if it was John Wayne, if they were gangsters, if they were boxing movies. Um, it didn't matter. It was
So have
just
you
I couldn't
have
get
you seen
enough.
have you seen The Godfather?
Oh yeah, we've had this discussion.
Yeah, I'll just tell you right now, you're the only one here who has seen The Godfather, and I feel terrible about it. I just have never had a chance in my life to see The Godfather.
Yeah, me
Right
either.
now, instead of being on this podcast, you should be watching The Godfather.
I know.
That's our homework, right?
Seriously, I need to
But
turn
yeah,
in my
I
night card.
mean, I think film is an excellent way to study, especially to study the scene. When I'm teaching scene to students, one of the things I love to talk about are movie examples because it's really easy to
Yeah.
grasp how scenes work when you talk about them in terms of film
And I gotta say, most people have seen
movies.
whatever movie you're thinking
It's
of, but they
it's
probably haven't read the book, you know?
you know
Right.
dealing teaching the age group that I do, I will often use movies as reference guides in order to make a particular point about writing because there are movies that are incredibly well written, and even though it's still a visual medium, the scripts still have to be of an appropriate quality. I was talking with my class this year and was mentioning on how to do endings, and I mentioned something about The Sixth Sense, and they all went, "What?" And I went,
I
"That's how I knew I
know.
was old. I thought about
That
quitting right
that
then.
was the clue.
Well, thank you, Heather. And then there's that too. So now I feel doubly old. So, but I picked that up for $5 at Walmart, and I showed it to him like the next day. I was like, this is mandatory viewing, like just for the way they set everything up and the story, the way the story unfolds. It does and can translate into fiction. So yeah, I mean you're not limited to just fiction. You can draw inspiration. You can read like a writer, nonfiction, poetry, film, scripts. Really, the possibilities are endless. If I can use a terribly
Oh,
overused trope.
I have to say, I mean, just reading biblical text or reading like the March of 10,000 by Xenophon, which is an ancient book, or reading writings of Cicero, or just places where you wouldn't think that you could really draw a lot of inspiration. I get a lot out of it. Sun Tzu's Art of War, just
Hmm.
things that really resonate and send me in a cool direction. where I
I
have
also think that they get your brain sort of going. I
yeah.
actually realize that the more that I am reading, the more I feel like I'm in the mood to write. I mean, if I end up getting feelings of, and I don't know if I really have writer's block so much as I just have procrastination or laziness, but
Hmm.
it's usually a product of me not reading and not having language in my life. That when my
Yeah.
life gets so busy that I get distracted and I'm not surrounding myself with language, then sitting down to write can be harder. But it's sort of that, the busier I am reading and making time to read, the easier it is for me to find time to write because I really do feel inspired to do it and
Yeah.
ready to do it.
I gotta say, a lot of people call me a procrastinator, and someday I'm gonna prove them wrong.
Well played, Steve.
Well played.
How many of these do you have on tap? I mean, are these off the top of your head, or you have these written down someplace? You're just
They're
waiting for the
endless.
opportunities?
You can't really see the top of my head in the video very well,
Uh-huh.
and but if you saw how much is stacked up there, I think you'd
There's a
be
lot.
surprised.
There's a
Yeah,
lot stacked up there. A
yeah.
lot of gorgeous hair there, Steve.
What are you
We
talking
all
about?
aren't so lucky. Okay. So, let's move on. Heather, how would you say, back on track, Heather, how would you say that reading as a writer is different than normal reading?
Well, I think that you still have to allow yourself probably as a little bit of normal reading
Hmm.
when you're a writer, as you said, just sometimes to just sort of disconnect and go into a text. Though I find that the longer that I write, the harder it is for me to do that. To not in some way feel like even if I'm really enjoying something, that there isn't a part of my brain that is
Analyzing.
analyzing and and noticing certain things. But I think one of the different one of the main things that I think that is different is that, at least for me, is I like to actually keep a notebook when I'm
Mhm.
reading, sort of next to me, because I don't like to write in my books. Some people
I
write in
write
their
in.
books. I don't write
I
in my
do.
books.
It's a love
um,
note to the author, Heather.
Yeah, Aaron, didn't you say that you was it you that said you like buying used books because that's part of the
Oh,
experience of
love it.
seeing other people's notes?
Oh, yeah,
I
because now I'm
I
involved in a community discussion about the text. Yeah, like bring that stuff on.
I'm
I got to say
now
See,
that's another
thinking.
cool thing about Kindle too is you get to see what other people have highlighted, what they thought was a unique, cool little quote out of the book, and that sort of thing as well.
I will say though, Heather, that admittedly, I can't turn that voice off. That voice is always
Yeah.
on, and it's always very, very loud. So for me to engage that voice is a lot better than just trying to ignore it because I'm very unsuccessful at it. So for me, like I will write in my books. I like knowing what I thought, 4 years ago. I like knowing what I think now. I like knowing what other people who've read the book think about it. There's a lot of gratification in that for me, a lot of satisfaction that I can take from that, and it helps me. I think it helps me read as a writer.
Yeah, I keep a notebook because what I think it's important is that when I'm reading is that I am engaging that part of my brain as a writer, to say that when I come across something, I'm actually studying how, let's say for instance, how a scene is constructed. Or let's say I run across a particular phrase. An author has, used a telling detail or has picked just the right word to evoke an emotion or to create an image. And I want to really study that. I want to look at that word and ask myself, why did the author choose this word? What makes it work? How would it be different if he chose a different word? I mean, I try to, anything that really stops me as a writer, draws my attention to it, then I want to ask several questions. I want to break it apart. And then I also like to look at the whole. I've gone so far as to essentially map entire short stories or books. And by that I mean, when I'm analyzing structure and pacing, is to go through and look at how long are each of these chapters? How do they begin? How do they end? How are they linked? What does that, if I think the pacing and the structure of a book is working, then I'm going to go break it down chapter by chapter, make notes, and try to graph it out so I can figure out what that author was doing that made it work so well,
Wow. So
so that
are
I
you
can
trying
apply
to
it.
like find the formula?
There's no formula. But there's nothing wrong with finding something that you think is done well,
Yeah.
figuring out how you think that the author did it. Because not so much that you want to mimic it, but because that allows you to then decide, would this work for what I'm writing? And if
Yeah.
so, how, or how might I even make it better?
Yeah.
You know, I did a blog post some years ago about Disneyland, and I absolutely love Disneyland. But I don't know if I've said this on the podcast before or not, but you know, I've already told you I can't turn that off. I can't turn off that voice in my head that's always analyzing and asking questions. And so when I was a kid, I would go to Disneyland and enjoy it, and I would go on the rides, and they were pretty, and there were lots of things to look at. And now as an adult taking my children, I'm going and I'm finding all the little, for lack of a better term, the chinks in the armor. I'm finding the exit signs. I'm finding how the rides actually work. I'm looking at the you know, the motors and the engines and the things that are all working together to create an atmosphere of magic, a magical realism, if you will. And there again, that satisfaction comes from that, from being able to pull the curtain back a little bit. It's akin to watching a magic show and being completely stunned and awed by what they're able to do, but then to think about it and to go back and watch it again. Okay, now what are they doing? How are they positioning their hands? What props are they using? What distraction techniques do they have working here? And you can do the same thing with fiction. How do they set up their characters? When you get to the end of A Rose for Emily, you want to go back and make a timeline and go, okay, what did I miss? How did I miss this? You know, you want to do that. You want to find out, you know, detail by detail how these things are accomplished to get that emotional payout that you have at the end when that story or that novel is just resonating with you, and it just sticks in the back of your mind and refuses to be ignored. There's a certain magic in that.
So, Aaron, let me ask you. You know, you say you can never turn that voice off in your head, but when you watch a movie, is that voice in your head?
All the time.
Even
100% of the
during
time.
movies, really?
During movies, poetry. I can't go to the museum. It's a disease, Steve.
Yeah, I think maybe you should be on some kind of medication. I'm just saying.
Now you sound like my wife.
Yeah.
There's
And
probably
my-
a syndrome named for that.
Yeah.
Google it.
Ganskyisms or something, yeah.
Over-analytical
Hypercriticism.
schizophrenia or something? Like
Yeah.
multiple personality disorder. Where
Yeah.
the personality is just overly critical
Yeah.
and
It's-
analyzing everything.
Must be wonderful being married to you.
I don't think my wife would agree with that, but I would love to be married to me, quite honestly. Now
This
it's just
turned awkward. Yep.
It just
Okay.
So
And
we're
on
moving.
that awkward, weird note, I think, guys, we're coming to the end of the podcast here. Let's get some closing thoughts out of y'all, and then we'll close it up.
Well, I think it's important to ask ourselves a couple questions when we're reading like writers. Don't be afraid to have those wonderful moments of magic and to appreciate that. But then also, you know, take a moment to try and pull that curtain back a little bit. Ask them how they accomplish that, and then also ask yourself a little more like reflective questions, such as how can I do something like this? In what way does would this technique benefit what I'm currently working on? Am I making some of the same mistakes as this writer? And always try and take that moment to reflect what you've learned, reflect on what you've learned, and apply it to your writing. Perhaps your current work in progress, or maybe something that you've finished up a couple years ago. But it's really important to have that moment of self-reflection when you're reading like a writer.
Very good. How about you, Heather?
Well, I think that since this is in conclusion, I'm just going to repeat sort of what we said early on because I think it's that important. I think that writers need to make time to read. And they should be reading things that inform what they're writing or to broaden, their writerly perspectives. We've talked about this tonight, all these different mediums that are out there. If you feel like, you don't have time right now to squeeze in reading, entire novels, if that's the excuse you're giving yourself,
Mm-hmm.
then give yourself permission to go and read essays or screenplays or poetry, anything that you think that you can study that will help you key in and improve something that you need to work on. And at the very least, if you are going to be writing a novel, and you need to make sure that you are well read, extremely well read, in whatever genre you are writing. I don't think we said this earlier. I think I remember reading something like this in Stephen King's On Writing and many other places.
Yeah.
That, if I woke up tomorrow and decided that I wanted to write a political thriller, then I need to make sure that I go out and I read as many political thrillers as I can. For many reasons. You want to see what's been done so far. What are the expectations of the genre that you're writing in? Because you may or may not choose to follow them, but if you're going to break those expectations, if you're going to go with outside, then you need to understand that you're doing it, and so you can do it well.
One of the guest hosts on the Writing Excuses podcast several weeks ago was talking about how he writes. I think it was something along the lines of crime thriller, that sort of story, and it had a lot of how the law system works, how the justice system works, and how police officers go about their investigations and so forth. And somebody asked him, when were you in law enforcement? He said, I was never in law enforcement. Well, when did you get exposure to all this stuff? And he said, I never actually had firsthand exposure. I just read a lot of books in that genre, and I picked up on it. Yeah. And that's incredible. That's a really good testament to how powerful this is, what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and there are a lot of things that, maybe not so much in literary fiction, but if you're writing genre fiction, there are so many conventions, right? So many expectations that certain genres have. That doesn't mean that you can't break them or subvert them, but before you go about doing that, you should probably understand what the readers of those genres expect from you.
Exactly.
And what those conventions are.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
Well, good podcast, guys. This is very fun. Aaron, you want to give everyone access to being able to get into contact with us? Give them keys?
The keys? I don't know if I have keys, but I'll give them addresses.
Okay.
So they can always find us on Facebook and on Twitter at Firsts in Fiction. They can send us emails at about First in Fiction podcast.
Somebody's going to be sitting at a computer and they're going to shift to Firsts in Fiction, shift to gmail.com.
There you go. How about just
remember, it's not just First in Fiction.
First in Fiction podcast at gmail.com. I like that I mess this up every week. That's fantastic. We look forward to new ways of me butchering it every week.
Right.
So you can always find me on Twitter at Eddie Gansky and on aarongansky.com.
And you can find me at Steve McLean on Twitter. And Heather?
You can find me at HDLuby on Twitter or at heatherluby.com.
Very cool. Okay,
so,
Aaron.
Thanks all for listening. And until next week.
Good writing.
I missed my cue there. I should have filled in. I'm sorry.
That's all right. Should we do it again? YouTube Extra.
No, it's cool. It's good. We'll leave it like that. Thank you, everyone, for watching on YouTube. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And we'll catch you next week. You all take care.
Bye.
Bye.